afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you joining us from the West Coast. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Victoria Thacker, and I will be your facilitator for today's session. This webinar is brought to you by the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada, the only global qualifying organization in Canada where you can become a chartered governance professional. For further information about our programs, our webinars like this one, or our events, I invite you to visit our website at www.cgiofcanada.ca. Today, we will be diving into what makes an effective chair with our speaker, Janis Riven. As a quick introduction, today's speaker, Ms. Riven, is a governance and compliance consultant based in Montreal. She is an adjunct professor at Concordia University's John Molson School of Business, where she teaches corporate governance. She's a sought-after speaker in Canada and internationally, and she has facilitated governance effectiveness for boards across various sectors. She's an experienced board member and has served on numerous boards. She was the vice president of compliance and secretary at RBC Insurance. She's a member of the Quebec Bar, a fellow of CGIC, and actively serves on multiple boards, including the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada, the Quebec branch, as well as the Foundation Hospital Rivière Rouge and Palm, which is a non-for-profit community organization. So lots of different experience to share with you today. Before we begin the presentation, please note that everyone has been muted, but if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll flag it for Janice. Use the Q&A function or note them in the chat. And again, I'll flag them for Ms. Riven and we can go from there. And now I will just pass it along to our speaker, Janis Riven. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And I'm quite happy I don't see all of you on my screen because I think I would get very nervous if I saw how many people I hope are attending and taking your lunch hour or a break through your day to be able to participate in this session. And I use the verb participate actively. While this is a webinar, as Victoria mentioned, you can put up your hand and I'm encouraging you to stop me anywhere. I don't have a lot of slides, so this is really about talking through a very important topic, and I encourage your comments, I encourage your stories, and we even have some issues to go through at the end of the presentation where I hope to have full interaction. So with that, I'll just move to the agenda. As usual, I always start by figuring out where do we fit in the legal sandbox? Whatever area of governance we're addressing, we have to think about where does it fit in the legal sandbox? What can we do? What can't we do to stay out of jail? And staying out of jail is the cost of doing business. And then we move forward into how do we do things to achieve our purpose more effectively. Then we'll move right into the role of a chair and the impact of being an effective chair. And I think this is, of course, what we're all really interested in, is that we know that you need somebody to lead a meeting, but how does that somebody do the best job possible? And we'll clean up the session with, as I mentioned, what I hope is an interactive discussion on when chairs are faced with particular dilemmas. We have to start off with an understanding of governing and what's important for effective governance. And for those of you who have heard me speak before or attended any of my sessions, I think it's very important to take a very simple approach to what do we have to do to effectively govern our organization. And effective governance is basically ensuring that the organization can achieve its purpose by making the best possible decisions. And the four principles of effective governance are transparency, accountability, independence, and participation. So for ease of remembering, think about tape. Think about what holds everything together, the organization, the governing principles and practices. So when we talk about transparency, it's that willingness to provide clear, timely, access to information. Opening the windows, bringing in the sunlight, helping those outside of your organization understand what the organization is doing, how well it's doing it, and why. To the more transparent you are, the more access to information, the wider you open your doors and your windows, the more likely it is that you will gain the trust and confidence that you need from your key stakeholders, which are essential to supporting the achievement of the purpose of your organization. So transparency is number one. Accountability, that's the principle of everyone in the organization being able to understand what their jobs are and to explain their actions. So this goes to who has the responsibilities and how do they perform their responsibilities. And from the viewpoint of governing, that essential requirement to account for how you achieve your responsibilities. So that's the accountability pillar. And we'll be talking about these throughout the discussion as to how the chair specifically helps to support these principles of effective governance. The third one is independence. And independence, as I mentioned before, goes to ensuring that your purpose is achieved by making the best possible decisions. The best possible decisions are made by those people who have the most knowledge, the most expertise, and the least conflict of interest. I think we all understand that any decision that is made or contributed to by someone whose interests are tainted by self-interest, there's going to be a doubt, an apprehension, or even a reality that that decision was made that could not be in the best interests of the organization. So independence is the third principle of effective governance. The fourth one that I think more and more organizations are beginning to understand that they haven't been paying too much attention to, is the principle of participation. And participation is the notion of giving a voice to the key stakeholders that support your organization. Traditionally, participation in corporations or with shareholders or with membership organizations was seen to be the voice of the organization is the board of directors, the decision-making body. And we have to start thinking about how does the board know what's happening outside of the brick walls of the organization? How does the board take into account the voices of employees, the voices of customers, the voices of regulators, and other voices of key stakeholders for which the organization depends for its sustainability, for its capacity to continue to stay in business? So more and more organizations are thinking about that inclusion notion that while there's a board of directors, the board votes, the board makes the decisions, how do we include more voices into the decision-making process to ensure that the organization is making the best possible decisions to achieve its purpose? So transparency, accountability, independence, and participation. So let's think about how that starts to work within the organization. Well, decisions get made in meetings. And that's where governing effectively needs to focus to ensure the best possible decisions are made by the ultimate decision-making body of an organization, which is the board of directors or others. So there are different kinds of meetings within the organizational and legal context. There's a legal requirement for corporations that are shareholder-based or membership-based to hold an annual general meeting at which members or shareholders are able to exercise the rights that are given to them under their constituting legislation. The legislation also provides for, under certain special circumstances, the right for shareholders and members to hold special meetings, to be able to hear their voices and cast their votes on specific matters that normally cannot be dealt with in an annual general meeting. So that's a legal requirement, holding those kinds of meetings. Now, what about board meetings? Because when we think about chairing, we're really thinking about board meetings. Well, there's nowhere in constituting legislation that you would necessarily see a provision that board meetings must be held. Only annual general meetings and special meetings. But the legislation does require that at least one director be appointed or elected. And under normal circumstances for the survival, sustainability, and better decision-making of an organization, organizations tend to have a board of directors. And that board of directors exercises its governance responsibilities in meetings. They get together, the individuals get together in a meeting context in order to make decisions. There's some exceptions. For example, most of you work for organizations where the constituting legislation, the act under which your organization was created, provides for the board to be able to make a decision in writing, but very limited. That decision in writing must be unanimous, and the writing has to be received by the organization from every director. So it's got to be a positive decision that is voted on by all the directors in writing in order for the decision to be valid. And most practices, most good practice for well-governed organizations tries to minimize the number of decisions that are made through writing, on the basis that when you're sending in a vote, you don't have an opportunity for discussion. Whereas in meetings, when people get together either in person or hybrid or virtual, it's the discussion process. It's the exchanging of information that is providing an assurance that the best possible decisions will be made. I'm pausing every now and then to see if any hands go up and giving Victoria a chance to let me know a hand's going to go up. The third kind of meetings at the governance level is meetings of board committees. And I say board committees because when we move outside the boardroom into how the organization is achieving its purpose, we get into management, and there can be lots of management committees. Management committees I'm not going to be touching on today, although in a lot of organizations, certainly when I worked at the Royal Bank and at RBC Insurance, management committee meetings tended to foster the same practices, the same protocols as you would find in board committee meetings. But committee meetings, board committee meetings, are meant to help the board make better decisions. How? By putting together a small group of people who may or may not be board members to focus their expertise, their particular interest, to do more in-depth research, more in-depth information gathering, to make reports, to consider the issues, to make a recommendation and provide the recommendation to the board for the board to make the ultimate decision. The board, it's up to the board to decide whether it accepts the recommendation or challenges the recommendation. But the responsibility of a board committee is to merely focus expertise, do the research, provide recommendations, or the board's decision-making.
There is a quick comment in the Q&A. It just
Yes.
says, just to add that in Canada, the Bank Act, Trust and Loan Companies Act, and Insurance Companies Act requires minimum 4 board meetings.
4 board meetings a year. Thank you. Thank you to whoever.
It was Ni Lang Desai.
Thank you. Yes, and it's quite interesting that was brought up because it's special legislation for financial institutions, which, because of the nature of financial institutions, creates more rigorous rules within that legislative sandbox. You'll find the same kind of thing happening with public entities or public bodies like state-owned enterprises, crown organizations. Because the legislation is special, the legislation itself can determine how many board meetings must be held in order to be able to provide a legal requirement for the governing body to have to meet and make decisions. So thank you for that. Under normal circumstances, though, remembering that the Canada Business Corporations Act, the Provincial Companies Acts, they tend to be one size fits all, and it's a huge umbrella. So they don't stipulate how many directors you have to have, how many meetings you have to have, because there are so many corporations that are set up that have one person doing the work, one person paying the bills, one person being the board of directors, one person being the shareholder, and they're not required to do very much except their filings and stay out of jail. So in all these circumstances, you need somebody to lead the meeting. Otherwise, chaos. So that's why there's a chair. And under the constituting legislation, as just mentioned, for example, there may or may not be, in fact, I know there isn't in the financial institutions legislation, the requirement to name a chair, although you usually find it in the bylaws. The constituting legislation does require a board of directors and as I mentioned, it could be one director, but then again, depending on the nature of your constituting legislation, you may be required to have a certain number of directors. For example, if you're a publicly listed company, then under regulation, you're required to have at least 3 directors. So it's very important to understand what are the constraints, what are the limitations, and what is going to be the impact of those constraints and limitations or responsibility requirements when it comes to assuming the role of the chair. As well, what's interesting here in Canada is our constituting legislation sets out, well, it doesn't set out specific responsibilities for a leader of the board. It does set out very specific responsibilities for every director and officer. And those are the duty of loyalty and the duty of care. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail, but in those circumstances, the chair of the board, whoever it has already assumed as a member of the board the requirements of their duty of loyalty and their duty of care. The being named by a board or by members, depending on what the process is, to become the chair and assume the responsibilities of the chair, it's very, very rare that chair role is given any additional powers or authority. The chair is merely assuming additional responsibilities added on to their duty of loyalty and their duty of care. So when we get into, well, what does that mean? What do I have to do? In many organizations, the bylaws of the organization, the internal rules that are negotiated and agreed to between the organization and the shareholders or the members, because bylaws have to be approved by your shareholders and members. Sometimes set out quite detailed descriptions of what is expected of the chair. And you'll also notice that in some bylaws, the chair is called the president. So it sometimes creates a lot of confusion. Is a president different from a chair? Words have to have meaning within your bylaws. And since the word president or chair in almost every circumstance is not referred to in the underlying constituting legislation, it's important in your organization's bylaws to understand that regardless of what word is used, that function is being set out as this function's primary responsibility is to lead the board in meetings. So it may include when they lead the board meetings, they may be the spokesperson for the organization. It may set out that they have a term of 2 years or 3 years, or there may not be a defined term. The bylaws will set out certain additional limitations. I think I see another hand up. Am I right?
Yeah, there was a question in the chat. It says, "Can a chair and the board members be part of upgrading the legislation or bylaws that govern the particular institution?"
Absolutely. Yes. In fact, often, I would say 99% of the time, the incentive to make changes to the bylaws come from the board saying, we need some changes, that our rules are too old-fashioned, or we can't move forward quickly enough because the bylaws constrain or are uncertain about how we should be interacting with our membership or our shareholders. So typically what happens is the board does a review of the bylaws. Often it's a governance committee. Will be responsible for doing a frequent bylaw review, making recommendations to, how can we be making our bylaws more reflective of how we want our organization to work, take it up to the board. The board will approve a bylaw amendment, and then in some circumstances, the law permits, your underlying legislation will permit the board of directors, once they've approved those changes to the bylaws, to actually put them into action, to start operating under their approved bylaw changes. But the law will require that it has to go to the shareholders or members at the next meeting, or as soon as possible, and that may be determined in your legislation. If the shareholders or members ratify the changes, you're good to go. If the shareholders or members say, we don't like the changes you made, the board immediately is required to go back to acting under the original bylaws. However, some bylaws restrict the board from being able to act immediately on their own approval, but you have to put it into your bylaws under most constituting legislation. And that's where I say bylaws are a negotiation between your members and shareholders and the board of directors representing the organization. I hope that answers the question. So yes, bylaws are really important for finding out, what exactly can we be doing? And certainly your leader of the board needs to be understanding those rules. But I generally find that it's not terribly useful to put into bylaws what the chair should be doing specifically. Because again, it's a role and responsibility that should be reflecting, what does this organization need? How complex is the organization? How big is the board? How many committees do we have? So my preference would be to keep the real job description of a chair, a board chair, or a committee chair out of the bylaws and put it into a charter, a mandate, a job description, whatever word you want to use, which is, I put here terms of reference or policies, but a formal written job description. Often the board chair's job description is embedded in the terms of reference of the board as a whole. So the responsibilities of the board are set out in the board's charter, and then the chair is expected to do a whole bunch of things in order to ensure that the board can fulfill its responsibilities effectively as set out in that particular document, whether it's called a terms of reference or a charter. Now, I mentioned other laws and regulations to which the organization is subject because that's exactly what happens. For example, if you're a publicly listed company, securities regulations require that a publicly listed company must have an audit committee. That's not necessarily found in other constituting legislation or regulations. Under the Bank Act regulations and trust company, insurance companies, so financial institutions regulations, the board must also have a conduct review committee. And then, of course, there's all the guidelines from the Office of Superintendent of Financial Institutions that, quote, recommends, but the moral suasion of the Office of the Superintendent is so powerful that it's very rare for a financial institution not to follow the guidelines. I would really call the OSFI guidelines on anything a wannabe regulation, something to pay attention to. So be careful to help your chair or as a chair understand where your responsibilities lie, what kind of documentation it's coming from, and where you have no choice or where you can help influence making more specific and more relevant the description of the roles and responsibilities of the chair. So let's talk about the chair as a leader. A chair needs to lead, whether it's a board or committee, number one, by ensuring there's a well-planned agenda. The agenda is, well, a lot of organizations treat it as a legal document. It's not. It's a checklist of what do we need to accomplish today. It's a plan. It's a meeting plan. And like all plans can change because a fist comes out of the sky, or there's a huge winter snowstorm and you don't have a quorum for your meeting. But you must have a plan. And the chair of the board, the chair of the committee owns the plan. Now, I know some of you on the webinar today are probably corporate secretaries, or you're advisors to the board, or you may be part of the leadership team and management, a CEO, and you're saying, 1 second here, it seems to me I'm doing all the work on the agenda. It's me, I'm stuck with it. But the fact is that while you may be doing an enormous amount of input into creating the agenda, influencing what goes into the agenda, at the end of the day, the chair of the board or the chair of the committee, if that person is allowing the agenda to be controlled by a CEO or by a member of the leadership team, or depending completely on the corp sec to tell me what do I have to do, and you tell me to jump 6 feet, I'll jump 8 feet. It's not right. The chair has to understand their responsibility is to own the agenda. So while they may not be doing all the work, they've got to understand and question, why are we doing this time? Why do we have to put this on the agenda as a decision this month? Can it wait? Can we have more discussion this month and put it off for next month? Because I think this is going to be something that our board members are going to want to discuss a lot. So making it a decision item today may be a mistake. That's the kind of input and that a good, effective chair is going to be looking for. Making sure that the members of your decision-making body, whether it's a board or a committee, have all the information that they need so that they can participate in the discussions and decision-making. The meetings are there as an information gathering and decision making. If there's no information to gather, what kind of decision can you put forward as being effective, informed, intelligent? So, question for chairs is, are my decision makers around the table, are they getting good information? Are they getting timely information? A good chair will not permit somebody to come into the meeting with information and throw it on the table and say, here's all you need, read it quickly, and now make a decision. A good chair will say, that's not allowed. I need my decision makers to have the information they need well ahead of time in order to be able to consider the validity of the information, whether they understand it, do they have some questions, and whether they can add additional information. So well before a meeting is often determined in board meeting protocols. So, does your board, does your committee require the information to be 3 days in advance, 5 days in advance? But a good rule of thumb is never throw information on the table at a board meeting and expect your board members to make a decision. Making sure that your advisors, your decision makers, your board committee members can appropriately provide their information, their expertise, and their experience in the discussion process. Boards are, every board member in an effective board is there because they provide value. They have something to say, they have a certain expertise that is unique and required for that board to be able to make the best possible decisions. So I could take a break right now, go into parentheses and do a whole half-hour discussion about making sure you have the right board members around the table and how do you deal with your skills matrix and finding gaps. But we'll close that parentheses today and maybe do it in another webinar. But because on the assumption that every single board member has something to contribute, the board committee chair wants to make sure that their voices are going to be heard. Helping the board reach a strongly supported decision is ensuring that there's as close to consensus as possible. We have this absolutely ridiculous paradigm of decision making here in North America, and most of us, I don't think I would say quickly, not in our indigenous communities, which they make decisions differently. But in our North American corporate culture, it's majority rules. Well, majority rules doesn't necessarily bring you to the best possible decision. It brings a decision. It's very effective at getting a decision made. Majority rules, as long as there's more on one side than the other side, but it's not the best possible way to make a decision. So helping the board reach a strongly supported decision, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I'm going to get into in the next 5 minutes about how a good chair can do that. Being the key communication link between the board or the committee and your leadership team. Remembering that the leadership team, the management have 100% of the information. The board, the decision-making body, generally don't have as much information as the leadership team. So being that link, making sure that the good information is flowing to the decision makers and that where there's concerns or needs for more information, that the chair becomes the link back to the leadership team through the CEO. Is there another question?
There is. It says, it seems like some boards and committees depend on management to prepare papers containing discussions as either information or decision papers and see their role as decision approval or information receiving, despite being certified directors. What are your thoughts on this trend?
Could you just read the last part? Because it sounds like there's a sense that here's that management's throwing throwing the can of soup into the boardroom and saying, you better eat this and don't add anything. Is that the nature of the question?
Yeah, it seems like it's kind of talking about that idea that boards and committees kind of depend on management to prepare everything, and then see their role as just decision approval or information rather than actually preparing it themselves as certified directors.
Yeah. Okay. And that makes sense. First of all, the responsibility of a board member is the board is not to be the expert on everything. You rely on the expertise of the management team, the financial expertise of the CFO, the marketing expertise of the head of marketing, etc. And when management is asking for a decision to be made, they're coming to the board and saying, here's the problem. Here's all the information that you need to understand how we want to solve this problem by putting more money into this, by opening a new branch, you name it. And they give recommendations. My response to that question is, if that's the kind of document, then the board should be demanding through the chair, 1 second, we want to understand all the options you looked at and why you decided that this was the best option. Because maybe as a board, as individuals, we have something to contribute that may look, well, you chose option C. Once you hear our input, maybe we should be changing to option B. So there's got to be room in the discussion prior to a decision for the board to be able to ask questions like, why did you take this as a key risk when we think maybe something else should be a key risk? So everything should be open to challenge, to question, and that's the board's job. Is each board member with their specific expertise and experience should be asking, not at the weeds, but at the strategic level, are you giving us everything we need in order to say that what you're putting forward is the best possible recommendation, and we'll agree to it? I mean, for those of you who have children, when your kids are at the dinner table and say, can we just, not have any more meat? Can we just move right to the ice cream? Because ice cream tastes better. As a parent, you say, yeah, I know ice cream tastes better, but it's not the best for you. So this is where the board needs to have that interlinking, that sense that they're empowered to ask the right questions.
Okay,
Okay.
so a quick follow-up question was, so if there is sufficient discussion in the paper and the directors have no different view, discussion may not be necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Although it's from the viewpoint of recording in the minutes, it's usually a good idea for the board to be able to show, if it's an important decision, that it has considered what was provided to them, has asked some questions, has had some discussion. Because if not, if the board consistently is approving management recommendations, then at some point, and management makes a bad recommendation, it hasn't been challenged, it hasn't been discussed, you get the situation of a rubber stamp board, and that leaves the directors vulnerable to liability. So it's a be careful situation. Okay, so last, and we're going to go through these in more detail, helping each of your directors or committee members be more effective. So where you feel people aren't speaking up, or if they're speaking up too loudly, or if you notice a committee member that's not coming to meetings frequently, it's up to the chair to say, hey, you're not coming to meetings. If you don't have time, can we take you off the committee and put somebody else in? How do you help everybody be more effective? Because your role is to help ensure the organization's making the best possible decisions in that meeting context. So as a conductor, I'm going to talk conductor, as a leader, and finally as a negotiator. So as a conductor, you're conducting the orchestra, make sure there's time for all the matters to be discussed and decided. And that goes back to why you want to be, don't let the agenda be put on your platter and say, okay, now you've got to eat it, and you've got to eat it in this time. It's up to you to decide what to put on your dinner plate as a chair, because decisions sometimes have to be made at within a certain time frame. So as a chair, you want to make sure that those decisions are at the top of the agenda and enough time is going to be allocated to be able to have full discussion and not rush through to decision. And that goes to setting the priorities of the meeting, making sure decisions are at the top of the agenda, discussion items in the middle, and then if there's time, if included in the information materials, there's information to help the board understand an emerging risk that may be discussed at the next meeting. Then if there's 5 or 10 minutes left, great. Also, ensuring you have time to have an in-camera meeting at the end of the meeting. Summarizing discussions to bring to a conclusion. Often there can be really heated debate, animated, and if you've got a large board, there's a lot of opinions, a lot of information floating around, a variety of directions to go to with respect to recommendations that are being provided by management. This is where a good chair will say, okay, I think I've heard it all. Now, if I understand correctly, here's what the key issues are. Here's how they've been addressed. And I would like the CorpSec to read out the revised motion for decision, because maybe during the discussion, there was a sense that instead of the recommendation to ask for a 15% bonus pool for staff, through the discussion, it's gone down to, given all the issues that the companies face this year, let's make it a 10% bonus pool. There may be some directors that are still stuck on 15%. You want to make sure that the decision that's being made is a decision that everybody understands. So that's an important part of bringing a discussion to a conclusion. Then it's helping your committee members, your board members to be effective. We all know those people. I'm sure you've all sat in meetings where there's one person who can suck the oxygen out of the room. Those are the ones that, don't understand that you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. You should be listening twice as much as you're talking, or even more. But on the other hand, you want to help empower those often really smart people. They're so busy listening, and they're thinking, gee, I wonder if I should speak up. I have a different opinion. Maybe there are people that don't feel comfortable challenging because they think if they say something different, it's going to be a challenge, an insult. Help these participants to speak up. So that's the conductor. Any questions?
Quick question in the chat from Dawn. It says, how do you ensure that the right amount of time is allocated?
I don't know, because I've chaired many meetings, and you start off, and typically, as I mentioned, that's where you prioritize your agenda really carefully. And that's why it shouldn't be something that you think you're stuck with, except for an AGM. Board meetings, you can approve an agenda, whatever you want, but change it to make sure that at the end of the meeting, the important stuff is being dealt with. So it may take longer for item number 1. So you take it away from a discussion item later on. But it's always that juggling and remembering that part of your job, the hardest job as a conductor, is to tell the double bass player to shut up. It's time to hear the violins. So that's kind of managing the people that suck the oxygen out of the room. So, oh, another question? I heard a pop.
We had a raised hand, but it just went down. We do have a
Okay.
question in the chat, though. It says,
Okay.
we have a few board members resign before their term is ended. They had 9 and now have 5. What are your thoughts on the remaining board members sitting on all the committees? There are 3, since the committees are now very small. We are recruiting for new board members, so this would be temporary.
If they're all going to be sitting on the same committee, I would say prolong the board meetings and do the committee meeting, because the committee informs the board. So I don't see why you'd have to double up meeting times. That would be my quick and dirty, since you're already planning to get those committees back and functioning, but you're looking for new directors, which means you're going to have to onboard them. It's going to take time for them to understand how things work to get your committees up and functioning and effective. So a suggested, I guess a suggested way to manage that transition is just convene longer board meetings and say, okay, we're going to start off our meeting. First, we're going to do finance or audit committee, then governance and nominations, and deal with those issues, and then decide on them based on the recommendations that come from the committee, if that's possible. Okay, so as a negotiator, this is where making sure that there's respectful debate, where there's strong differences, and you do that. My one recommendation for chairing is be yourself. Be who you are. If you were selected by your peers to lead the meetings, to be the president or the chair, it means you're already respected. So just be yourself. Don't try to be pompous. Don't try to follow Robert's Rules of Order or speak in different languages that you don't usually use. Be yourself, because that helps your fellow board members be themselves, be more relaxed. But where somebody breaks in and interrupts somebody speaking, or somebody uses a swear word, that's your time to say, hey, chill. This is not the way we do things. Let's finish listening to Jane and John. Can you cool your language down? If there's something comes up that's contentious, for example, somebody who fails to declare a conflict of interest and it becomes debatable whether it's a conflict of interest, adjourn the meeting, postpone the decision, work out what the issues are outside of the meeting if it starts to get too hot, and then come back into the meeting with people's tempers down, with potential outcomes that are better, properly negotiated, understood, and accepted. Understand that everyone has a responsibility to participate. So helping your offside board members say, where are you? Are you really present? I call directors who aren't really doing their job, I call them ghosts. They're filling a seat, but they're ghosts. And a hockey team can't have a ghost goalie. Ghosts can't protect the net. So you need to have real people who are really participating. And as the chair, that's part of your job. Helping to summarize discussions. That's one of the jobs I mentioned as a leader, and making sure you're doing it in a way that you're not influencing the vote as, taking on assumed authority or assumed importance by saying, okay, now as the chair, I get to frame things the way I think they should be framed. You got to be really good at that mediator, objective person, despite the fact that as a chair, you are going to cast your vote, but you're not going to influence the way others cast their vote. And remind, if there's been a difficult discussion and if there's been some dissent in the decision, remind the members that regardless of how the board or the committee decided, once a decision is made, when you leave the meeting, despite the fact that you may have dissented, you have to support the outcome positively.
There is a quick question in
Yeah.
the chat. It just says, should a time limit be set for the meeting from the outset?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think it's fair to ask people to come to a meeting and never know when they're going to go home or whether they're going to miss their train or their plane. Absolutely. And the way to do that fairly is to make sure you give enough meeting time. People love when I love giving a half day facilitation and ending it a half hour early. Nobody complains that, oh, Janis ended half an hour early. So think of it that way. Think of your own life and what you appreciate. So as the communication link, here's where the chair is acting as a pipeline, ensuring the maintenance, the creation and maintenance of positive relationships with those that you depend on as part of the decision-making process. So that's the board itself, relies very heavily on the CEO, the executive director, and the key members of the leadership team. The chair of the board relies very heavily on committee chairs to be able to articulate the work of their committees and provide the recommendations in an articulate and appropriate way for the board meeting to be able to make their decisions. So the board chair is the major link to the CEO for administrative issues, ensuring that management issues that are brought appropriately to the board, whether there's somebody, oh, I wish I had more time. I tell you some of my stories about finding out that on one board, that a key member of the leadership team had multiple staff resign, and it turned out there was underlying harassment, but nobody knew about it. Nobody was being told. So these are really important for good chair to be able to get these issues up from the management team. Management says, gee, should we don't, we're not going to look so good, so maybe we won't tell the board. So a chair is going to help CEOs bring out the bad stuff and feel safe doing so the board can support the CEO in making better decisions. Creating a team from the board. It's not a group of people coming together to make expert decisions. It's a team. Every single board member has a different strength, a different weakness, and it's only together as a team that you make the best possible decisions. That's how games are won, by strong teams, not by strong players. So with the CEO becomes the link between the leadership team and the board through the chair, and acts as the liaison between the board and the leadership team. The CEO will attend, is usually present at all board meetings, may have a member of their leadership team be the key staff liaison for various committees. And in many corporate circumstances, the CEO is also a member of the board, and I won't do my rant about that. But in membership organizations, there's no question the CEO is expected to attend every meeting and only leave if there's an in-camera session. And with committee chairs, the board chair has to make sure that the committee is effectively fulfilling its mandate and that the chairs are open and have an open link to the chair of the board to let them know if there's any key issues. Any questions? Because we've got a few minutes left and I want to talk about some of these dilemmas.
We do have 2 questions in the
Sure.
chat and 1 hand raised. So I'm going to quickly do the one in the chat first.
Okay.
What if there is a strong dissenting voice to the point of asking the dissension to be noted in the minutes?
I think anybody who votes against a decision should be recorded in the minutes unless they say, I don't want to be recorded, because from the viewpoint of legal protection, if a bad decision has been made, the recorded dissenter is protected because they voted against. So that's something that in the onboarding process, you should help your directors understand that, that how they protect themselves is having recorded in the minutes that they have dissented to a decision.
Perfect. The second question is, large organizations have many subsidiaries, which with its cross-platform and functional employee directors on the subsidy boards. What is your take on chair's responsibility around escalating issues raised at the subsidiary board to the enterprise level senior management?
Okay, that's another webinar on subsidiary management or subsidiary governance. Quick and dirty, the chair of the subsidiary board is the link to the chair of the parent board. And I can bet you $1 that that chair was selected by the parent board to be the link. So a key responsibility.
And the last question here is, should direct contact between the ET and individual board members be allowed?
I think that goes to the culture of the organization, how large it is. Certainly in small membership organizations, it would not be unusual for the board members to feel free to call the ED. But if it's getting in the way of the ED being able to do their day job, this is where the linkage with the ED is very important, where the ED goes to the chair and says, you know, Joe's calling me 3 times a day to ask me this and that. The chair of the board speaks to Joe and says, oh, back off. And in other situations, I've seen it right in the protocols and the policies and of individual directors, is if you have a question to management, take it to the chair or take it to the corporate secretary. Do not contact management directly. So it all depends. Sorry about that.
Okay, why don't we keep going, and then at the end we can address any
All
further
right,
questions.
if we have time for the end. So here I have some dilemmas. So I'll read out the first one, and then I want to hear from you what you think about how you handle the situation during and after. So the first one is, you're the chair of your meeting. The executive director has provided her written report the afternoon before the meeting. At the meeting, the executive director is not even following the format of the report and is focusing on all the positive actions she's taken over the past 6 months. What do you do during the meeting? What do you do after the meeting? Any thoughts? Who wants to speak up? I'll answer the question if I don't hear in 5 seconds.
Feel free to use the raise hand function.
Oh,
We can
thank
let you
you. I
speak.
see some.
Okay, let's go for Sarah. Go ahead, Sarah. Oh, it looks like you're muted. Sarah?
As the board has not
There
had sufficient time to look at the material, I would suggest that the board meeting be adjourned and reconvened at a different time, so that the matters could be reviewed more fully, because the existing board members would have no knowledge of what was to be expected of them, and that would be part of what I would say.
Thank you for that, Sarah. I think provided there's no request for a decision at the meeting, you just say thank you, and we'll defer any questions to the next meeting, since the board members haven't been given time to read it in advance. But that's it. Yeah, absolutely no decisions. How about after the meeting? You got any thoughts on that, Sarah? Or?
I would just say that after the meeting, the chair should just have a meeting with the board members and say that in future, if you require documents to be presented, they should be given in a timely manner. And if this executive director didn't even follow the instructions in the first hand, maybe they should be re-educated as to what was required. I don't know. In some instances, boards actually have to do a periodic test on what is required by the board members in meetings and things like that, responsibilities of being a board member. So perhaps the board should revisit that. I respectfully say.
That's pretty thorough. Thank you for that, Sarah. Hopefully this board has an in-camera session where the ED leaves and the whole board will say, what happened there? This is just really weird. And of course, you know, there'll be blowback from that. So thank you for that. I think I'm just going to, because of our time constraints, I'll just do one more and leave you with the other one. I think I'll do number 3 because I've seen this happen. So you're chairing your first meeting of the board after the annual meeting, and it's your first term as a chair. A fellow board member who's in her second term as a director starts correcting how you're managing the meeting. How would you deal with that during the meeting and after?
Okay, let's go for Neil.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Hi, Janis. Yeah, I think this is a quite sensitive matter, and I will I will think that he should have a in-camera session with the directors to sort out any issues here.
absolutely. Yes. How would you manage it during the meeting? You know, with this person constantly interrupting you?
Well, I'll just say that we'll discuss later on, and then move the meeting agenda, because that will kind of nullify the very purpose of the meeting in an orderly manner.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Can we take one more comment? I see Frank Myers.
Yeah, here's Frank. Go ahead, Frank.
I've actually had a situation like that. The first time I chaired a listed bank, where a board member who's been on the board for a long time before me was objecting to my restructuring of the agenda. I managed to defer it until the end of the meeting, and dealt with it outside the main part of the meeting. And thereafter, it seemed to have smoothed the whole situation. It was getting quite contentious, but I managed to put him off till the very end of the meeting.
Thank you for that, Frank. I mean, because that's part of what you're doing is you're trying to improve the culture of the boardroom, act as a team, and you don't have your defense player telling the goalie how to protect the net. So, and you did it in a respectful way. Thank you for that. I just want to leave you with this quote that I love: to lead people, walk beside them, be a leader from the middle. As for the best leaders, the people do not notice their existence. When the best leaders' work is done, people say we did it ourselves. So leaders aren't, especially in the context of governance, mostly you're leading from the middle and mostly you're leading from behind. So I'll leave you with that thought for the day. And thank you very much. I've got my email and contact information. I'm sorry we didn't have time to do the other issue. If you have any questions or any thoughts, or you want to hammer back at me because you don't agree with me, feel free. I love getting emails from my fellow people who are interested in improving governance. So thank you very much for all your time.